The opening scene of the awakening trip unfolds as a quiet, emotionally charged portrait of transition, centering Chelsea's arrival in the city as both a literal journey and a symbolic crossing from containment into possibility. And what makes the scene resonate for queer audiences is not any sense of spectacle, but the careful attention to internal states, unspoken histories, and the fragile boundary between memory and desire. Chelsea arrives sheltered, curious, and tentative, carrying with her the imprint of a conservative upbringing that has shaped not only her expectations of adulthood, but also the limits of what she believes she is allowed to want. And Poppy, positioned as her step-cousin and guide, embodies everything Chelsea has been told is risky, expansive, and alluring about a life lived more openly, making their dynamic less about romance and more about the charged proximity of difference, freedom, and identification. The city itself becomes an unspoken character, representing permission, anonymity, and the chance to reimagine oneself. And Chelsea's excitement about beginning her adult life is rendered with tenderness rather than bravado, echoing how many queer women recognize that early adulthood is often not a confident leap, but a careful negotiation between who we have been allowed to be and who we might become. If given space, Poppy's encouragement is framed not as predatory or sensational, but as an invitation to self-reflection and self-trust, though the film wisely complicates this by acknowledging that guidance can blur into influence when power dynamics, age, or emotional experience differ, a tension that mirrors real-world queer awakenings where admiration and identification can feel inseparable from attraction. The decision to pause the narrative with a nap is deceptively simple, functioning as a liminal moment where exhaustion lowers defenses and the past seeps into the present, and it is here that the memory of a long-ago kiss surfaces not as an erotic flashback, but as a marker of unfinished emotional business, something Chelsea hoped would remain buried, not because it was harmful, but because it revealed feelings she was never taught how to hold. When Poppy gently references the memory, the scene does not rush toward action, but instead lingers in Chelsea's embodied response: blushing, hesitation, recognition, capturing how queer memory often lives in the body long before it is articulated in language, and how first awakenings can feel both tender and mortifying in hindsight. Chelsea's admission that she remembers is less a declaration than a quiet acknowledgement of continuity, that the burning feeling she carries has not disappeared with time but simply gone unnamed, which speaks powerfully to lesbian and queer viewers who recognize how desire can persist beneath layers of denial, distance, or moral instruction. Crucially, the scene frames this moment as one of awareness rather than consummation, emphasizing emotional intimacy and self-recognition over physicality. And in doing so, it challenges the assumption that queer stories must either sanitize desire entirely or sensationalize it to be legible. Instead, it invites viewers, especially women, to sit with ambiguity, to consider how attraction, admiration, and longing can coexist without immediate resolution, and how ethical boundaries are part of authentic self-discovery rather than obstacles to it. Society's discomfort with women's same-sex desire is reflected in the way Chelsea has internalized embarrassment and restraint, having learned that curiosity itself is something to be managed or forgotten, and the film pushes back gently by allowing her feelings to exist without punishment or spectacle, asserting that noticing, remembering, and questioning are valid steps toward authenticity. Poppy's role, meanwhile, is symbolically complex, representing both a mirror of who Chelsea might become and a reminder that awakening does not occur in a vacuum, but within networks of relationship that require care and responsibility, a nuance often absent from more simplistic coming-out narratives. For queer women, this scene resonates because it captures the truth that awakening is rarely a single dramatic event, but a series of small, emotionally charged recognitions. Moments when we realize that what we felt once still matters, that who we were is connected to who we are becoming. For women more broadly, the scene speaks to the universal experience of stepping into adulthood while carrying unresolved parts of the self, of wanting guidance without surrendering agency, and of learning that emotional safety sometimes means sitting with feelings rather than acting on them. By centering stillness, eye contact, and memory, the awakening trip positions lesbian experience not as taboo or fantasy, but as a human process of becoming visible to oneself, reminding viewers that truth often begins not with action, but with the courage to remember and to stay present with what arises. Scene 2 of The Awakening Trip deepens the film's emotional complexity by shifting from the quiet intimacy of discovery into the messier terrain of desire, jealousy, and unspoken power dynamics, all while remaining rooted in women's interior experiences rather than spectacle. And what makes this scene resonate so strongly for queer audiences is how clearly it captures the destabilizing moment when attraction multiplies and certainty dissolves. Chelsea and Poppy's exploration of the city has already begun to blur into an exploration of self, and the rooftop sunbathing functions as a visual metaphor for exposure and openness, bodies and emotions alike warmed by new possibility. When Maggie's return interrupts that fragile bubble, reintroducing history, comparison, and competition into a space that had felt contained and safe. Chelsea's reaction to Maggie is immediate and unsettling, not because Maggie behaves provocatively, but because Chelsea recognizes something in herself she has not yet learned how to name. An awareness of another woman's magnetism that feels both thrilling and disorienting, especially for someone whose identity has been shaped by restraint and expectation. Maggie's presence complicates Chelsea's understanding of what it means to be drawn to women, revealing that attraction is not a singular revelation but a widening field. And for lesbian and queer viewers, this moment reflects the often overlooked truth that awakening can feel chaotic rather than clarifying, marked by multiple points of desire that challenge the fantasy of a clean, linear coming-out narrative. Poppy's annoyance, subtle but palpable, introduces another layer, one rooted not in malice but in fear. As she senses the shift in attention and the threat of losing her role as Chelsea's sole guide, a fear that mirrors real-world dynamics where the person who introduces someone to freedom can struggle when that freedom begins to include others. Maggie, for her part, is rendered not as a villain, but as a figure of melancholy confidence, someone who has learned how to hold desire with both gentleness and distance. And her gaze toward Chelsea carries not predation but recognition, as though she sees in Chelsea a younger version of herself, still learning how to stand inside her own wanting. The later confrontation between Maggie and Poppy strips away the performative ease of the earlier rooftop moment, allowing the women to articulate what had been simmering beneath the surface. And Poppy's insistence that Maggie not steal Chelsea reveals how easily concern can slide into control when boundaries are unclear and emotions are unresolved. Maggie's refusal to accept the role of Big Bad Wolf is significant, as it challenges the tendency to frame queer desire as inherently dangerous or corrupting, a narrative often imposed on women who are confident in their sexuality, and her assertion reframes desire as something that can be held with care rather than conquest. Chelsea's plea that Maggie be gentle is especially poignant, as it underscores how Chelsea is caught between her own curiosity and a fear of harm, a fear shaped by years of being told that wanting too much or too freely leads to damage. And this moment captures a universal tension for women navigating intimacy, the desire to be seen and chosen without being overwhelmed or defined by another's expectations. Maggie's playful yet deliberate response, paired with her gentle physical reassurance toward Poppy, softens the scene without resolving its tensions, illustrating how intimacy between women can be layered with history, rivalry, affection, and unresolved longing all at once. The kiss between Maggie and Poppy is framed not as a betrayal but as a reminder of shared pasts and lingering bonds, suggesting that desire does not vanish simply because circumstances change. And for queer viewers, this moment resonates as an honest acknowledgement of how relationships often overlap, rather than conclude neatly. Societally, this scene pushes against the discomfort with women's same-sex desire by refusing to moralize or simplify it, instead presenting attraction as complex, relational, and deeply human. And that discomfort persists largely because women's desire, especially when it is plural, fluid, or unapologetic, resists easy categorization and control. Symbolically, Chelsea represents the self at the threshold, newly aware and overwhelmed. Poppy embodies the tension between guidance and possession, and Maggie stands for the possibility of desire that is neither forbidden nor innocent, but experienced and self-aware, and together they mirror real-world pressures on queer women to justify their feelings, to rank them, or to deny them altogether for the sake of harmony. By allowing these dynamics to unfold without judgment or spectacle, the awakening trip affirms that becoming visible to oneself often involves discomfort, jealousy, and contradiction, and that these feelings do not invalidate desire, but rather reveal its depth, offering viewers a portrayal of lesbian experience that is honest, emotionally grounded, and reflective of the real work of navigating connection in all its imperfect human forms. Scene 3 of the awakening trip marks a turning point where desire becomes impossible to ignore, not because anything overt happens, but because the internal experience of attraction becomes so loud it drowns out reason. And what makes this scene resonate so deeply for queer audiences is its precision in capturing the feeling of wanting someone you have been told, implicitly or explicitly, you should not want. A feeling that lives in the body long before it ever finds language. Chelsea's attraction to Maggie is not framed as sudden or shocking, but as something that has been quietly accumulating since their first shared space, built from glances held a second too long, from the electricity of proximity, from the way Maggie's presence feels less like authority and more like invitation. And this distinction is crucial, because Maggie is not positioned as a guardian or moral guide, but as a woman fully inhabiting herself, someone whose age does not diminish her vitality but instead sharpens it, making Chelsea's fascination feel less transgressive and more revelatory. Maggie's confidence, her ease in her own skin, the way she moves through a room as though she expects to be seen rather than asking permission to exist, stands in stark contrast to Chelsea's tentative selfhood, and for many queer women, this dynamic mirrors the formative experience of encountering someone who embodies a version of freedom they did not yet know was possible. Sitting together on the sofa, the scene narrows its focus to Chelsea's interiority, her racing thoughts, her sudden awareness of breadth and distance, capturing how desire often manifests as disruption, making even casual conversation feel impossible. And this portrayal honors the truth that attraction is not always convenient or neat, especially when it arrives before one feels ready to claim it. Maggie's openness about her relationship, her admission that love can be both fierce and volatile, destabilizes Chelsea's assumptions about what intimacy looks like, offering a vision of connection that is neither sanitized nor shameful. And Chelsea's shock is less about judgment than about recognition, as though she is glimpsing a future version of herself that is capable of loving fully without self-erasure. Maggie's moment of vulnerability, her fear that Chelsea might be disgusted by her honesty, reframes her confidence as something hard-won rather than effortless, revealing the tenderness beneath her poise, and this exchange becomes a quiet negotiation of trust, one where Maggie does not assert herself as knowing more, but instead risks being seen as she is. The question "want to know what it feels like?" is left deliberately ambiguous, not as an invitation to action, but as an opening to possibility, encapsulating the essence of queer longing as something that exists first in imagination and emotional attunement rather than physicality. And by stopping here, the scene resists the urge to resolve tension prematurely, allowing desire to remain a question rather than an answer. For lesbian and broader LGBTQ+ viewers, this moment reflects the familiar experience of feeling attraction bloom in spaces where it was never explicitly forbidden, yet never openly acknowledged. Spaces shaped by unspoken rules that suggest some desires are acceptable while others must be carefully managed or deferred. Society's discomfort with women expressing desire for other women persists precisely because such desire undermines narratives that frame women as passive recipients rather than active participants in longing. And this scene challenges that discomfort by centering Chelsea's wanting as something natural, human, and deeply felt rather than reckless or immoral. Symbolically, Chelsea represents the self on the cusp of transformation, caught between the safety of innocence and the pull of experience, while Maggie embodies a future self who has survived loving intensely and remains open despite the cost, and their interaction mirrors the real-world pressures queer women face to minimize their feelings, to question their legitimacy, or to seek external validation before trusting their own hearts. Importantly, the scene does not rush to define what this attraction means, allowing space for uncertainty, fear, and curiosity to coexist, and in doing so, it offers a portrayal of queer experience that values emotional honesty over resolution. The awakening trip uses this moment to affirm that becoming visible to oneself often begins not with action, but with acknowledgement, with the quiet courage to admit "I feel this," even when the path forward is unclear. And for viewers seeking authenticity rather than spectacle, this scene stands as a testament to the power of restraint, nuance, and emotional truth in telling lesbian stories that honor the complexity of desire without reducing it to taboo or fantasy. Scene 4 of The Awakening Trip brings the film's emotional threads into a reflective, quietly revelatory close, centering not on action but on meaning, as Chelsea's sense of wonder and belonging crystallizes in the aftermath of emotional upheaval and connection. And what makes this scene particularly resonant for queer audiences is how it frames joy not as something loud or scandalous, but as something deeply felt and almost disorienting in its gentleness. Chelsea's happiness is immediately noticed by Poppy, whose teasing suspicion carries the familiar rhythm of chosen family banter, a dynamic that signals safety and intimacy rather than surveillance. And Chelsea's innocent deflection, confused, playful, unguarded, reveals how profoundly her emotional world has shifted since arriving in the city, as though happiness itself has become a new language she is still learning to speak. The joking reference to Maggie as a wicked witch is telling, not because it frames Maggie as dangerous, but because it reclaims a long-standing cultural trope used to police powerful women, especially queer women, and turns it into something affectionate and admiring, underscoring how women within this household negotiate desire and authority through humor rather than shame. Poppy's admission that Maggie is wickedly talented reframes her earlier defensiveness as admiration laced with complexity, suggesting that tension between women does not have to culminate in rivalry, but can coexist with respect and shared affection, a subtle challenge to narratives that pit women against one another in competition for love. When Maggie enters the scene, her ease and flirtatious warmth function less as provocation and more as confirmation that this household operates on openness and emotional literacy. And the knowing looks exchanged between Chelsea and Poppy signal a shift in Chelsea's position from outsider to participant, someone who now understands the unspoken rhythms of this chosen family. The scene's choice to imply intimacy between Maggie and Poppy without detailing it keeps the focus squarely on Chelsea's internal experience rather than external spectacle. honoring the instruction that queer stories need not perform desire to validate it, and instead allowing Chelsea's reflective voice to carry the emotional weight. Her dreamlike monologue situates her experience within a broader existential framework, acknowledging the speed with which life can change when one steps outside prescribed roles. And for many queer viewers, this reflection echoes the moment of realizing that leaving one restrictive environment often means finding oneself embraced by another, not perfect, but alive with possibility. Chelsea's recognition that she ran away from one family and into the arms of another captures the bittersweet truth that self-discovery often requires both loss and gain, and that chosen families, while not without their own complexities, can offer a form of emotional safety that biological or conservative structures could not. The invocation of the stars and fate resists cynicism without veering into fantasy, suggesting instead that meaning emerges not from destiny alone but from the courage to follow curiosity, to remain open to pleasure, connection, and transformation. Even when outcomes are uncertain, society's discomfort with women's queer joy is quietly challenged here, not through confrontation but through normalization, as Chelsea's happiness is neither punished nor problematized, but simply allowed to exist as a natural consequence of being seen and welcomed. This discomfort persists, largely because women's fulfillment, particularly when it is not mediated by men or traditional roles, destabilizes entrenched ideas about dependency and propriety, and the awakening trip counters this by presenting fulfillment as relational, communal, and self-directed, symbolically. Chelsea represents the self in bloom, newly aware that pleasure and belonging are not indulgences but vital aspects of a full life, while Poppy embodies the complicated protector, learning to release control in favor of trust. And Maggie stands as a reminder that confidence and tenderness are not opposites but complementary forces in queer connection. Together, their interactions mirror the real-world pressures queer women face to justify happiness, to explain desire, or to downplay joy to avoid scrutiny. And by ending this scene on reflection rather than resolution, the film affirms that awakening is not a destination but an ongoing process. For viewers seeking authenticity rather than spectacle, this final moment offers reassurance that becoming visible to oneself can feel like waking into warmth after a long night, uncertain of what comes next, but finally unafraid to welcome it.